Hey there, NGINX here. In this video, we're going to go over setting up a local Kubernetes cluster using the KinD tool, which stands for Kubernetes in Docker. It's a great tool to spin up a Kubernetes local cluster because it just all runs within Docker. That means you can run one command and you're going to have a multi-node or a single node cluster up and running in about a minute. It also works on native Linux, WSL2 within Linux, as well as Mac OS. So in addition to running this KinD cluster, we're actually going to be doing it through Terraform using the KinD provider. We're going to also set up an NGINX Ingress controller using Helm, all managed within Terraform. So we're going to have a single Terraform config file. Well, technically it's broken out into a couple config files, but we'll just be able to run a Terraform apply to have your cluster up and running, ready to go. So now you can run whatever services that you'd like on your cluster and have them all working through localhost. So that's the agenda for this video. I have all the config files here ready to go. They will be up on my blog by the time that you watch this video. So I'll leave a link to that in the description if you ever want to take a look here at the code. So before we get rolling here, let me just run this demo script, which is basically just going to be running Terraform apply and then just spinning up like a little dummy service so we can check things out. But this is from ground zero. So, the script doesn't run a Terraform init, but we can see here that if I scroll up here, there is no Terraform related files, based on state or just installing specific plugins that we need here or providers. So if I run a Terraform init here, we're going to install all the provider plugins that we need here. And we're going to go over all this code in a second here. I just want to get this init out of the way here and also just start running this demo script here. And let's take a look here at this demo script while it runs. It's really nothing fancy at all. All it runs is a Terraform apply here with auto approve just so we don't need to type in yes. Then it's going to go to KinD's documentation here. They have an example Echo web server service basically. So we're going to apply that into our cluster and then just curl basically the foo path here on localhost just to get a foo response because it's basically an Echo service. Basically this script is just a one-shot script that we can run to make sure everything is up and running without having to manually install like a test service or something like that. But we can see here, this is all working. And now it's just running Terraform apply. We can see we are using the Helm resource here to install the NGINX Ingress controller. And we're going to go over all this configuration. We can also see here too, there's the KinD cluster provider. This resource is up and running. It's spinning up a local cluster named demo local. This is all good to go. You can see it's taking a little bit here. This is normal. It takes a little bit over a minute here. Eventually, once this completes, then it's going to install the NGINX Ingress controller using Helm. But let's not just wait for this thing here, and let's look at some of the tools that I just spoke about here. So this is KinD's documentation, Kubernetes and Docker. You don't need to run this through Terraform. They have a command line tool that you could install and use instead. But my philosophy here is if I'm going to be using Terraform in production and maybe like a staging environment on whatever cloud provider I decide to use, right? This could be Amazon with the EKS, it could be on Google Cloud, maybe DigitalOcean or Linode, basically pick your poison, right? All of these cloud providers are really good, and a lot of them do have managed Kubernetes. But, KinD in this case is just meant to run a local Kubernetes cluster. But still, if I'm going to be using Terraform to manage, let's say, EKS on Amazon, I might as well also use Terraform to manage KinD as well in development. And now, even when it comes to something like the NGINX Ingress controller, chances are if you're using a cloud provider, you may end up using your cloud provider's Ingress controller instead. Like, for example, on AWS, there's a load balancer controller, which you would use instead of the NGINX Ingress controller. But for locally, this combo of KinD and NGINX Ingress controller, which is over here, the official one from Kubernetes, really, really good combo. You can also use this one in production as well. But, if you're on AWS, at least the AWS load balancer controller offers a little bit more perks, but maybe that's a video for another day. And so Terraform, again, we're not going to go over super basics about Terraform here, but it doesn't have a built-in provider for KinD, but luckily this author here created one, and that's what we're using here. Author is also super responsive because I noticed in some of the documentation, it was a little bit skimpy. So there were some things that I just didn't know what to do because it wasn't documented, but eventually I figured it out. I opened up an issue and then even ended up opening up a pull request just to add a little bit more to their documentation here. What did I add? Just basically how to convert some stuff from KinD's YAML config, because again, KinD does have a command line tool that you can run. You can also pass in a config file using YAML. Actually, I think I did a video about using the env substitute command in the past, which I'll link to in a card, where I actually did spin up a KinD cluster using EKSCTL instead. EKSCTL was related to spinning up a cluster on AWS. Never mind, but I think there was some video, I don't know, maybe went over KinD in a different video. Yeah, so many videos. But in any case, yeah, this should all be up and running now. Cool. So yeah, this went through, ran a Terraform apply, and eventually got to the point where that cluster was created here. And then it is going to install the NGINX Ingress controller using Helm. And then I also set up a null resource here to basically just wait for the Ingress to be ready. And we'll go over all this code in a second here. But yeah, eventually after that, we get to the point where we just add that echo service running into our cluster, and then we just curl localhost foo here, basically this code that just ran over here, and then we actually get the response there and it all works. So if I actually curl localhost foo here, we can just see it's echoing back what we have. And if I run a kubectl get all on everything, we can see that the Kubernetes cluster is up and running. It actually runs two different services here. This one from KinD here, foo and bar. I didn't go to the bar one, but that's what this is running here. And we can see, the most important part, right, is the Kubernetes cluster is up and running. The NGINX Ingress controller is running in Ingress NGINX as the namespace. And yeah, we are all ready to go. So now if you had your custom workload or whatever services that you want to run within a local cluster, you can now do that. But yeah, let's start looking at some of this code here for Terraform. And I'm just going to open up my sidebar just so we can easier look at this stuff. So yeah, number one, we have a couple of different providers that we needed to install. So there's that KinD provider that we just took a look here on GitHub, right? We need to install this thing. Then we want to install the Kubernetes official one from HashiCorp, which is the company who makes Terraform. They have a provider for Kubernetes as well as Helm. So we're going to use both of those. And I really like locking down my versions to the exact version instead of using something like, the tilde operator like this or whatever. I don't know. I've just gotten bit so many times in the past where I used like a rough estimation for a version number, and even just bumping up the patch release to the next one resulted in something breaking. So I really like explicitly going all the way down to the exact patch version. Yeah, it's a little bit more work needing to update these things a little more frequently, but that is work I'm worth doing because, stability, especially in a production environment, is number one priority, or at least a very high priority. I don't care that it takes me an extra couple of minutes a week or something just to update patch releases, just by having to go into a file and update a version number. But yeah, so there's also the null resource from HashiCorp as well. We'll go over that in a bit. Technically, I think everything is going to work with an older version of Terraform, but Terraform was 1.0 not too long ago. So you might as well just make sure that you're running 1.0 or above. But I think technically 0.15 and above, maybe even 14 should work here. But yeah, let's start diving into some of this other config file, right? So we just went into versions there. Let's maybe take a look here at some variables, like certain things that we can configure very easily. So in this case, we have something like the cluster name. So I decided to name it demo local over here. Then also we can configure where we want our kube config file to be written to. So by default, this KinD cluster provider that we were just looking at over here, this one, it will write out your kube config file to the current directory of wherever you run Terraform. And actually, if you use the KinD CLI tool, it ends up writing it out to your kube config file path here, which I kind of prefer because I just don't want to have this file lingering in this current directory. You'd have to git ignore it then because there's sensitive information there about accessing your cluster. It basically comes down to preference. So in this case, and again, this is not an open source module that I created or anything. This is just a one-off thing where, yeah, this position I'm working at now, we're setting up all sorts of different Terraform infrastructure, including Kubernetes. And, part of that for me starts with getting things running locally in development. So I wanted to set up a KinD cluster. But yes, so we can configure where this config file gets located, totally up to you. We can also choose what Ingress NGINX version that we'd like to use based on what Helm version is available. So in this case, 4.05 at the time of making this video is the latest version. You can always drop that down to an earlier version. You can always go and check out NGINX's repo on GitHub here and see some of the releases. So if you go to releases here, then they have a list. Oh, look at that. See that? 4 days ago, 4.06 came out, but this code was written sometime last week. So 4.05 was the latest version. And actually, I think that's a great segue into just why use Helm to manage all this, and why not just apply it directly with kubectl into your cluster like you totally could. Now, this is a development cluster, so the need for uptime isn't super critical, right? I can just decide to update this to 4.06, which I am actually going to do now. And then all I have to do here is Terraform apply this. And I'm not going to bother doing auto approve just so we can see what's going to change in the cluster. So we're basically just doing a live update now of the NGINX Ingress controller using Helm. And we can see here Terraform is going to let us know, by the way, we're going to be doing this one change here from 4.05 to 4.06. This is going to change. Cool. Well, the null resource is triggered to always change, but I'll get to that one in a bit here. But yeah, this is just a live update now to NGINX Ingress controller of 4.06, which right now, by default, this thing is only configured to have one replica, so this is going to have a downtime event where the server is just not going to be responsive, where any of your, the NGINX Ingress is not going to be responsive for about, I don't know, maybe like 5 or 10 seconds. But yeah, in development, this isn't a big deal. Also, it becomes a non-issue if you decide to just run multiple replicas, which you probably would do in production, even if you decide to use the Ingress NGINX controller as well. So we can see right now, we're just waiting for it to be up and running. It's all good now. And actually, if we go back and run a kubectl get all a, it is now up and running too for 27 seconds here. This is version 4.06. So cool. Like that made it super easy, right? Just to update a new version of NGINX there. Nice. So yeah, the last thing here is if you wanted to customize what namespace the NGINX Ingress controller is going to be in, this will actually create it for you because Helm has that capability to basically create a namespace if it doesn't exist. In my opinion, it's a really good idea to dump this into a custom namespace instead of using the actual default Kubernetes namespace. But yeah, that's up to you here. Just a very simple configuration thing here. Now, with all that out of the way, let's take a look here at the KinD cluster config file first. And again, if you're new to Terraform or not a super pro with Terraform, because I'm definitely not, I have these things all separated out into different files, but you could totally just have all of this in a main.tf file, but I prefer to have them broken out because it's a little bit easier to reason about. But we can see here we're configuring the Kubernetes provider as well as the KinD cluster provider, this resource here, to use that custom config path that we defined inside of our variables. And since we are using tilde here, if I jump back to the versions one, variables one, we can see we're using tilde here to be a shortcut to your home directory. I actually don't want to cat this file out because it does have some sensitive information in there because I do have other clusters being managed. But yeah, going back to here, this actual config file, we do need to run path expand on that. Otherwise, it's going to like literally write it out to a tilde directory within the current working directory. And funny enough, well, not funny enough, but again, with Terraform, you just can't run things like path expand inside of the variables. So that's why I'm not running path expand here and then just referencing it here. Yeah, you need to call them out in these actual individual config files. But takeaway here is this is how you set up a KinD cluster using Terraform. So, we can pop in the name, whatever the cluster name that we'd like, right? Ours was demo local. We can customize optionally where this path is going to be located. If you actually didn't have this property in here, then it's just going to write it out by default to the current working directory. Let's wait until everything is running before Terraform reports back if it works or not. And then we can also customize the KinD config file. So going back to the documentation for KinD here, there's all sorts of different configuration that you can add here. And this could be done on the command line if you happen to use KinD, their CLI tool here, right? You can do like KinD create cluster and then give it a name. But, infrastructure as code is a nice thing. So it's nice to have all that's in a Terraform config file instead of just like ad hoc running a command in the command line, right? But, KinD also does have a config file itself. Like there is a YAML file that you can configure somewhere down here, which I did use in the past before I started using Terraform. But we can see here, yeah, this is an example config file that you could set up, all sorts of different things that you can do. And then, then you can just pass in this config file from the command line. But again, we're replacing all of that with Terraform. So instead of writing a YAML config file for KinD, we're going to have all that configuration in here. So we have things like the API version, and we can even configure specific things about the control plane, because if we go back to the documentation here for Ingress, to get all this to work, yeah, you need to do some stuff around setting extra port mapping and basically this configuration that we see here. So for the control plane, yeah, we need to patch like kube ADM config patches. You need to do this stuff, and then extra port maps for like, if you're going to have your service running over port 80 as well as 443, which I happen to do, because you just want to be able to go to localhost directly over HTTP or HTTPS without customizing a port, then yeah, you just need to add this configuration in. And this configuration literally that we're looking at right here is this configuration here, but in Terraform like HCL config instead of YAML. So we can see we have the extra port mappings for 80 and 443, as well as just popping in this custom kubectl config patches here. It looks a little bit messy here. Yeah, it needs to be basically inline YAML. Right now, this provider resource doesn't have a way to yeah, configure this in a different way. I guess you could technically make this like a multi-line string to make it a little bit cleaner, to get rid of needing to like, put everything on one line. But in any case, that's basically the same config file, right? And then for the other worker node, we don't need to configure anything special. And yeah, this gets you going completely with KinD, capable of running NGINX Ingress controller, being capable of accessing these ports here. So we can just go to localhost. Nice. So now let's take a look here at the Ingress configuration itself. So this one also, we are configuring Helm Kubernetes here to use the same Kubernetes config path, just so we can access our cluster, from the kube config file location that we took a look at before in the variables. Sorry, my brain just paused there for a second. But anyways, yeah, this is the official Helm release from HashiCorp here, right? So we can just manage our Helm stuff here instead of having to run an ad hoc Helm command. And again, this just goes back to, it's kind of nice to have everything in Terraform configuration so that you can just run a Terraform apply instead of having to run something like a KinD command to create the cluster, then another Helm command to install and configure the NGINX Ingress controller, and then maybe another command to do this, another command to do that. Before you know it, you're writing like, all these shell scripts here or wrappers around tools where you're just running like 4 different command line tools. But if you have it all defined here in Terraform configuration, you can just Terraform apply and you're good to go. The only reason I actually have this demo script over here is because this is totally separate, like custom workload stuff. Like the only reason this literally exists here is just to demonstrate that the Ingress is actually working. So like normally this code wouldn't be here at all. Normally you'd have like your own web service or whatever you're trying to run in your cluster, right? But yeah, let's go back to that Helm setup here, and that is over here. So in this case, yep, we're just gonna grab the official NGINX Ingress controller, just using all the documentation that's applied, that is supplied on Helm's provider. So we have this resource here where we have the name and the repository and the chart. All this stuff is like just, standard stuff you'd run on the command line using Helm's tool, but in Terraform format. And then we can also pop in whatever version that we want, right? 4.06 in this case. We are also going to make sure that it runs in the namespace based on a variable. And if that namespace doesn't exist, then this is going to create it by default for us, which is really nice, because if this wasn't here, then this namespace would have to exist beforehand. Then we need to do a little bit of configuration when it comes to configuring the NGINX Ingress controller to work with KinD, and that's actually going to be in this YAML file here, which we will take a look at in a second. But lastly here, depends on. So yeah, this provider or resource has no idea about the cluster being a dependency of this. So we can't install the NGINX Ingress controller into a cluster until the cluster actually exists. So in this case, we're just saying depends on, then we have KinD cluster default here. So if I jump back to over here, that is this guy over here. So basically, the Helm setup just won't happen until this is completely ready to go. So that's why we have that depends on there. But if we didn't have that, then yeah, the NGINX controller is going to be it's going to be installed before the cluster is ready, and then we're just going to get continuous errors there. So this fixes that entirely, which is one of those things, kind of why I'm making this video, right? It's these little, I don't want to say edge cases, but things to think about, right? Even going back to here, this wasn't super obvious because it wasn't even documented at the time of when I did it, but now it is, but cool. So yeah, let's go to this values config file here. Again, this is not even super important to go over, but it's very important that you do these things here. Otherwise, KinD is just not going to be, compatible with the NGINX Ingress controller. So if you just Helm install the NGINX Ingress controller without defining these custom YAML properties, then the Ingress controller is just never going to be up and it's never going to work. And it's interesting because if you go to here, their actual documentation for the Ingress, and you scroll down somewhere, it actually says to, if you want to install the NGINX Ingress controller without using Helm, they do have this example over here. So if we go to this example here, and again, you could just kubectl apply this one. But if you do this, yeah, there's all sorts of different configuration options here for the NGINX Ingress. I'm not going to go through all of them, but it's somewhere in here. I'm trying to if I can just one shot find it really quickly here. But yeah, there's basically just a whole bunch of different custom properties that we pass into the NGINX Ingress controller, and those custom properties from this YAML file are what we're porting back over here. And this was a son of a gun to get working. Fortunately, I didn't have to go to that config file and map every custom value over. I did find an issue somewhere in KinD's repo where there was a closed issue about it getting working with Helm when you installed the NGINX Ingress controller. And yeah, someone basically had this ready to go to copy paste, which is amazing because something like this would have taken probably multiple hours just to make sure that every single one of these is set correctly and like which ones do you actually need versus like not needing. But it turns out like all of these are necessary. And even this one here, which is like a little bit funky. So when you're dealing with YAML, right, you can have a Boolean defined as true and false. And typically, you know, just as a good habit, it's a good idea to quote your strings. But in this case, this actually needs to be a true value that is quoted. So very important there. If you don't do this one, your NGINX Ingress controller is not going to come up correctly and things are just not going to work. But yeah, once we have all of this configured and ready to go, then yeah, it is up and running and all nice. Now, there is one last step here to get all of this going, and that is basically waiting for the Ingress controller to be ready. So if we go back to our output here and scroll up before we did the upgrade, then it actually does take a little bit of time. Usually I want to say maybe 20, like 30 seconds or so for this Ingress controller to be ready. So what I ended up doing there was we're just using local exec inside of this provisioner here for a null resource. So basically, to my understanding, again, not a Terraform expert yet, with null resource, you can basically just run some arbitrary code that you like that's not associated to a specific resource here. In this case, we're just running a local exec. Yeah, just running kubectl wait, and it's going to wait 90 seconds until the NGINX controller is ready. And in this case, this actually would only ever run once, like when you first create things. Well, actually, let me rewind. If you took this provider and you dropped it inside of here, which technically is valid syntax, then it's only going to run once when you first set up the cluster. But we just saw now, like we decided to upgrade to Helm NGINX Ingress controller like 4.06. If we did that, then this is actually not going to run because that's like part of doing a Helm upgrade, not like a Helm install or create. So this null resource lets us basically apply this all the time, whether or not we're creating something or updating something. And we're just triggering it on a unique UUID. So you can also trigger this on like, you know, like a date time or something like that. But this is guarantees that this is going to run basically every single time we run a Terraform apply. And in this case, like I'll just run it again now, like it's going to finish very, very fast because in this case, there's nothing to wait for because, you know, this time around, we're actually not making a change, right? We're not going to be updating to a new version of the Ingress controller here, but we can see though that this is going to be triggered and we are going to run that. So in this case though, you can see it's going to finish like immediately, right? Within like 1 second. And all it's doing, yeah, kubectl wait for this specific pod to be ready, which is the NGINX Ingress controller. It'll eventually time out after 90 seconds. I ran this thing so many different times, so many different environments. It really never takes longer than 30 seconds. And in fact, like I didn't just come up with this magically like off the top of my head. It is like a general concept, but if we go back to here, this is actually literally this command here where we're just going to wait for it to come up. And yeah, I just dropped it into local exec here. This is the command that we're going to run. Will require you to have kubectl installed locally, which you probably do if you're working with Kubernetes anyways. But yeah, that's all good to go here. And this one, like, this Helm release here depends on the cluster being up. Well, this one depends on the Helm release NGINX controller to be ready as well. So yeah, just make sure the ordering of all this stuff happens in the correct order because we want this to happen last after this one finishes up. Although this one doesn't wait until the Ingress controller is actually ready. You know, there's some webhook that needs to fire or whatever. Like, I don't know the implementation details, but I just know that we need to wait until this happens and then we're good to go. So like technically, right, like you can totally have this resource not here. Like let's remove this from the config file, right? But then, you know, we're back to like, well, now you're going to need like technically maybe another wrapper script around this one and run your kubectl like wait command here instead. And like, why? If you can have it all set up in one command where you can just Terraform apply it without having to run additional things, then that's really handy. And it's really important too, because if you try to install your service into the cluster before the NGINX Ingress controller is ready, then that is actually going to fail. So like this line would fail here if that controller wasn't ready. And yeah, that's not good, right? You want to have this stuff to be basically as bulletproof as possible. So I think Terraform really helps there a lot, and really happy with the setup now. You know, because prior to this, I was just using all these different command line tools in unison, and it totally worked. But now it's like, this is cool. This is something I can commit up to GitHub all in one like infrastructure repo or Terraform repo or something like that. And someone else can clone it down and just up it and run it, you know, as long as they have like kubectl installed or whatever, and they're good to go. So that's going to be it for this video. Getting all this up and running is, yeah, a nice little exercise. Let me know in the comments below if you're going to do this. Also, let me know if you are using a different tool for local Kubernetes development. I did try a couple of them. I just figured where I just found that KinD was the best one for me, at least, because just waiting 1 minute for an entire cluster to be up and running was pretty nice. And yeah, didn't get any weird networking issues and stuff like that. Yeah, with that said, Is there anything else to cover? I don't think so. That's everything, right? Here's how you can install kubectl, by the way. I'll leave a link to this one in the description if you need it, but chances are if you're watching this video, you already have it installed. Yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up because it helps a lot. And on that note, I will see you in the next video.